Welcome back to Daily with the Word. I wanted to start this morning's devotional by telling you a little story, something that happened to me when I was a teenager. Most of you already know, if you know me at all, that I was saved when I was 16 years old and went to a very good church. In our church, our youth pastor encouraged us as soon as we got saved to start reading our Bible, to start praying. But one of the things he really pushed us on was start inviting people to church. Try to have a testimony before them. Try to encourage them to come to church. Even if you don't know how to win somebody to Christ, at least talk about how you got saved. And so I started doing that. I tried to be a testimony to the people in my family, tried to be a testimony to the people at our school, tried to be a testimony to the people in our neighborhood. Well, what happened during that time was everything went well for a while. It seemed like I had the idea behind what I was trying to accomplish. And so right beside our house was an empty field. And so one day we were playing football in this empty field, kind of sandlot type football, if you know what I'm talking about. And we played tackle football. And so a bunch of guys gathered together and, we marked off what we thought were the boundaries. This tree is the end zone, past this tree is the end zone on that side. If you cross this into this yard, that's the end zone on this side. And it's kind of a makeshift field. There were no lines or anything, we just had markers that we thought you could find. So anyway, as the play progressed, several of my friends were there, and a good friend of mine, Buddy Jordan, who I'd really been witnessing to, trying to get Buddy to come to church, trying to get Buddy to get saved, trying to do everything I could do to tell him how wonderful a Christian life was. I'd only been saved for a couple of months, and I think Buddy was kind of growing tired of hearing me talk about church and that sort of thing. Well, during this game, Buddy was on one team, I was on the other team. And there was a certain play where Buddy went out for a pass. The guy who was playing quarterback threw a beautiful pass to him. He caught the ball and took off for the end zone. Well, I took off chasing him. Buddy was a little bigger, a little heavier than I was, so I was able to catch up with him. And I grabbed him from behind and I took him down. And I'll have to admit, I took him down pretty hard. Well, what I didn't realize at the time was when I took him down, he had already crossed the goal line and into what we called the end zone. We went down hard. He got up, and I mean, he was mad. Now, Buddy's bigger than I was, so that kind of made me a little nervous. So I just tried to ignore it and walk away. He kept hollering and screaming, "Why did you do that? Why are you hurt? You tried to hurt me." And I said, "Man, I'm sorry. I didn't realize we were in the end zone." Well, as I turned and walked away, Buddy's temper didn't get any better. He didn't like that. He got very angry. He picked up the football, and as hard as he could, he threw it and beamed me right in the back of the head with it. And just like you might expect for a young teenager, I spun around and I cursed him out. Yep, that's what I said. I cursed him out. I mean, all kinds of foul words came out of my mouth. You blankety, blankety, blank, blank, blank. I'll never forget what Buddy said that day. He looked at me, dropped his arms, and said, "That's what I thought." And I stood there for a second waiting for the next sentence, and he said, "I knew you weren't really a Christian." Phew, that hurt. I'd never really thought about my personal testimony. I'd heard the word before in church. I heard people talk about their testimony, or I heard people give a testimony, but I didn't think that a testimony was something you lived. I thought it was just something you said. I learned that day that my testimony is more than what I say, it's also what I do. If you look in the New Testament, you'll find the word testimony is not there very often. In fact, there's a couple of times it's mentioned. It's mentioned in the book of Acts when it's talking about David. What a wonderful testimony David had. Acts chapter 13, verse 22 said this. This is the testimony David had. It said, "I have found David, the son of Jesse, a man after mine own heart." That was God's testimony about David, that David lived a life that made him a man that it was obvious that he was a man that sought after God's own heart. You find the same kind of testimony, by the way, about Enoch. Enoch was, in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, he was the man who was translated, who never really died. He just left. He was walking on the earth one day, and the next day he was walking in heaven. Hebrews 11:5 says this about Enoch. It says, "By faith, Enoch was translated that he should not see death, and was not found because God had translated him." Now listen to the reason. Before his translation, he had this testimony, that he pleased God. I don't know if you've ever thought about the term testimony, but it's technically a legal term. It literally means the evidence recorded or the witness given. In the New Testament, there's another word you'll see often used for the word testimony, and that is the word conversation. For instance, Philippians chapter 1, verse 27 says this, "Only let your conversation be as it becometh the gospel of Christ." You could say the same thing, only let your testimony be as it becometh the gospel of Christ, or your witness, or your manner of living. That's probably the best translation. The way you live before an unsaved world, and even the way you live before Christians, that's your testimony. Hebrews chapter 13 says the same thing. Let your conversation be without covetousness, and be content with such things as you have, for he saith, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. James chapter 3, verse 13. Who is a wise man and endued with knowledge among you? Let him show out of a good conversation his works with meekness of wisdom. So here's the question I want to pose before you this morning. What is the best evidence of your testimony? I really thought about this a long time, and I think there's basically three main evidences of your testimony. Number one, your testimony is evidenced by your actions. One of my favorite passages of Scripture, James chapter 1, verse 22, but be ye doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving your own selves. You see, when I was a teenager, I got in my mind what I said was my testimony, and what I said is part of my testimony, but that's not all it is. It's not just what I say, it's what I do. Your actions, what you will do. 1 John chapter 3, Jesus said this, and hereby we know that we know him. John said this, and hereby we know that we know him if we keep his commandments. Jesus made this statement to his disciples in John chapter 13, verse 35. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples. You know what that evidence is? He said, if you have love one toward another. I thought about that. There's a lot of things Jesus could have said there. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you go to church faithfully. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you read the Bible. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you give faithfully. There's a lot of things that could have been the evidence or the testimony of the fact that you're a disciple of Christ. And Jesus said the greatest of all those evidences are your love. So when I think about my testimony, I think I can honestly say that your testimony is evidenced by the things that you do. We call ourselves a Christian, but are we kind? Are we forgiving? Are we truly loving? We call ourselves Christian servants, but are we joyful? Are we patient? Are we long-suffering? So your testimony is evidenced by the things that you do. But I think even further, your testimony is also evidenced by the things that you don't do, by your actions, or you could say it this way, your non-actions. Ephesians chapter 2, I love this passage. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1 through 3 say this, and you hath he quickened, now listen to the tense here, who were dead in trespasses of sin. That's what you were. Wherein in time past you walked, that's what you used to do. You walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince and power of the air, the spirit that now worketh in the children of disobedience, among whom we all had our conversation. In other words, we had a lifestyle, we had a different conversation, a different testimony before. We also had our conversation in times past in the lust of the flesh, the fulfilling of the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature the children of wrath, even as others. All those things that were talked about, you were dead in trespasses and sin. You used to walk according to the course of the world. You had your conversation in the times past according to the lust of the flesh. You were by nature the children of wrath. All those things should have changed. Not only our actions, but what we don't by what we do, but also our inactions or our non-actions by what we don't do. I really believe that the world kind of looks at Christians in the light of the Ten Commandments. In other words, they say, if you don't do this, and you don't do this, and you don't do this, and you don't do this, then you must be a Christian. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make into any graven image. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. Remember, honor thy father and mother. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor, thou shalt not covet. So the world looks at it sometimes as not just what we say and what we do, but the world looks at it by what you don't do. I like the little song that I was taught in Sunday school when I was a teenager. Some of you may remember the little song, the things I used to do, I don't do them anymore. And of course, it repeats itself. The things I don't do them anymore. The things I don't do, I used to do, I don't do them anymore. There's been a great change since I've been born again. The things I used to say, the places I used to go, as the song goes on, a lot of things have changed. And there's some things nowadays that I don't do that I used to do. And I think that's also an evidence of your testimony. But for me, the greatest evidence of your testimony isn't just what you do or what you don't do. The greatest evidence of your testimony is your reaction to what others have done. I think that to me, I think I guess in two specific areas. Number one, your reactions or how you respond to what others do. Let me read you a passage of scripture that I think is really one of the toughest passages of scriptures in the Bible. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 9 said this, "Finally, brethren, be all of one mind, having compassion one of another, love as brethren, be pitiful or full of pity, be courteous, not rendering evil for evil or railing for railing, but contrariwise blessing, knowing that thereunto you are called, that you should inherit a blessing." That's a tough passage of me because it says I cannot render evil for evil. Romans chapter 12 pretty much says the same thing. Romans chapter 12 verse 17 says this, "Recompense to no man evil for evil." Proverbs chapter 24 verse 29 says this, "Say not I will do unto him as he has done to me. I will render to the man according to his work." 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, "See that none render evil for evil unto any man, but ever follow that which is good, both among yourselves and to all men." I remember some time back I was counseling a married couple, and every time I talked to the guy, he came across with the right answer. He seemed to say the right things. And at one point, his wife got very frustrated, and she said, "He's saying all the right things now, but he doesn't do all those things." And he got a little upset with her criticizing him. And I said, "Why don't you stand up? Why don't you just walk out in the hallway for a minute? Leave the door open. Let me talk to her for just a second. You walk down the hallway and then walk back." And when he walked away, I asked her, I said, what's the problem? Why are you so angry? She said, "Well, what you don't know is," and he's not admitting to, when we're at home, he curses me when he gets angry. I said, "He does?" And she said, "Yeah, he's hateful and he's mean to me all the time." She said, "He's not physically abusive, but he's very verbally abusive." And she went on and on. She said, that's what he really does. And I said to her, I still remember saying to her, "Well, great." I said, "I have the exact passage of scripture that you need to understand, and if you that can answer all your problems." She said, "You do?" I said, "Yeah, let me read you a passage of scripture, and here's what I want you to do." She listened with great interest, thinking this is her moment to shine. And I read her Matthew chapter 5, verse 44, which says this, "But I say unto them, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be the children of your Father which is in heaven." I looked at her after I read that passage of scripture, and I said this. I said, when your husband curses you, do you bless him? When he's hateful to you, do you love him? When he's being verbally abusive, do you pray for him? She got very angry and she said, "No, I don't do those things because he doesn't deserve it." Can I tell you something? That's part of our testimony as a Christian, how we respond to how others treat us. I used to say it this way. I believe there's 3 levels of response. I believe there's the devil's level, that is, responding evil for good and evil for evil. I believe there's what I would call the world's level, that is, giving good for good and evil for evil. And then there's a Christian level. The Christian level is this: I give good for good and I give good for evil. And that's how we're supposed to respond. So I think your testimony is evidenced by what's going on around you and how you respond to it. But more than that, I think it's evidenced by how you respond to not only what others do, but to what God's doing. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 says, "Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not into thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your path." Several years ago, I was in the hospital with a young lady who was dying of cancer. And just at the last moment before she passed away, I remember kneeling over her bed, and her name was Kathy, and I said, "Kathy," we talked about her family, we talked about other things, but the last thing I said to her was this: "Kathy, do you still trust God?" And here's a young lady who was dying of cancer. She just had a new baby a few months before, and she was leaving her husband with those 3 daughters. And I'd ask her this question, do you still trust God? I'll never forget her answer. She said, Brother Morris, no matter what happens, I'll still trust him. One of the greatest testimonies of the grace of God and the work of God in a person's life and the confidence and trust in God that I ever heard. Can I ask you a question? When you think about these things, which is the greatest test of your testimony? Your actions? Yeah, of course they are. Your inactions or your non-actions, what you don't do? Of course they are. But I think the hardest testimony to keep is your reactions. And I believe it's your reactions because of this. I believe your reactions reveal what's really in your heart. See, it's out of the heart that the mouth speaketh. What's in the well, somebody once said, comes out what's in the well comes up in the bucket. That's why it's important for us to keep your heart, like Solomon said, keep your heart with all diligence, because out of it are the issues of life. It's easy to live right sometimes, and it's easy to say there's some things I won't do. But how you respond to circumstances and how you respond to trial and how you respond to how people are testing you, that's really, I think, the greatest evidence of your salvation. Jesus said to the Pharisees, you hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you, saying, this people draweth nigh to me with their mouth, and they honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. I've said it this way. I don't believe the Lord will ever do a work through us until he's first done a work in us. I think our prayer this morning should be the same prayer that David prayed in Psalm 139. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my ways, and see if there be any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way of everlasting. You see, if my heart is right, my actions will be right, the things that I do. My inactions or non-actions will be right. There'll be some things I won't do. And my reactions will be right. And only then can I have a right and strong testimony before God. During this time of global pandemic, the world's watching you. And I pray that your actions, your inactions, and especially your reactions are Christ-like.